one of the big concerns that we have every year, but especially this year, given how dry it's been, is the increasing threat of wildfires.
The water was gone by morning. 16,000 acres of Florida wetland that had been submerged for years sat exposed under the sun, and the ground was moving.
Right now, there's very little to no water within the footprint of the Everglades except for man-made waterways, such as these canals, like the one behind us here.
Dr. Jennifer Rehage stepped onto the drained lakebed and felt something push back against her boot. She looked down. The mud was riddled with holes, hundreds of them, and from each one came a wet, scraping sound. Armored creatures were crawling through a tunnel system, carved directly beneath her feet. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part came 3 days later, when crews reached the deeper channels and found burrows large enough to crawl into. What was living inside them had been hiding beneath every tourist, every airboat, every fisherman who'd ever crossed this water. The hidden world, exposed. This was Stormwater Treatment Area 1 West, a man-made wetland in South Florida designed to filter agricultural runoff before it reaches the Everglades. For years, it did its job quietly under several feet of murky water. Nobody thought twice about what lived at the bottom. Then water managers initiated a routine drawdown for maintenance, pumping millions of gallons out of the marsh over 72 hours. Here's the catch. When you drain a Florida wetland, you don't just lower the water. You rip the cover off everything that's been hiding beneath it. The field team arrived expecting a standard survey. Maybe some stranded bass, a few invasive tilapia, nothing they hadn't documented before. Instead, they walked into absolute chaos. Shallow pools were packed so tightly with thrashing fish that the water had disappeared beneath the bodies. The banks looked like Swiss cheese, pockmarked with holes of every size. And in the exposed mud, creatures that had no business being in Florida were crawling in every direction, their armored bodies scraping against each other in a sound one researcher compared to dragging sandpaper across concrete. Dr. Rehage had studied Everglades fish for 15 years. She'd seen drawdowns before, but nothing like this. She told her team this wasn't an infestation anymore. This was a full-scale colonization. And they were standing directly on top of it. The smell hit them next. Thousands of fish dying in shallow, sun-heated water creates a stench you can detect from miles away. Native species were suffocating in real time. But scattered among the dying bass and bluegill, other creatures were very much alive, waiting, watching, completely unbothered by the catastrophe unfolding around them. But the fish writhing in the puddles were just the surface problem. The real invasion had gone underground, and the team was about to discover just how deep it went. The armored colonizers. The first documented threat was the armored catfish. These South American invaders are covered in interlocking bony plates that make them nearly indestructible. Birds choke trying to swallow them. Small alligators can't crush their shells. The Florida sun, which normally bakes, stranded fish into jerky within hours, barely affects them. And unlike every native species suffocating in the shrinking pools, the armored catfish were just sitting there on the mud because they can breathe air. And get this. These fish don't just swim around like normal species, they dig. Armored catfish excavate burrows deep into wetland banks, creating tunnel networks that remain completely invisible when water levels are normal. The entrances stay submerged, hidden by vegetation, undetectable to anyone passing overhead. Dr. Rehage's team walked the exposed banks with handheld counters, clicking every time they passed a burrow entrance. They counted over 400 holes in a single 200-meter stretch. 400 entry points to an underground network nobody knew existed. She reached down and pulled out a chunk of bank material. It crumbled in her hand like wet cardboard. The structural integrity of the wetland was being hollowed out from the inside. Here's the thing, nobody tells you about these burrows. Every tunnel weakens the surrounding soil. Every excavation severs the root systems of native plants trying to stabilize the banks. Water that's supposed to stay contained in the treatment area seeps through the riddled earth like it's draining through a sieve. The district had been fighting erosion problems for years without understanding the cause. Now they were staring at it. Dr. Rehage told her colleagues they weren't just fighting an invasive fish anymore. They were watching an engineering disaster unfold in slow motion beneath millions of acres of protected wetland. The catfish had been quietly destroying the infrastructure of the Everglades while everyone focused on what was swimming above them. but the catfish burrows looked like pinholes compared to what crews found when they pushed into the deeper drainage zones. Something much larger had been digging down there, and it was still home. The underground python cities in the Picayune Strand, part of the largest ecosystem restoration project in American history, workers were clearing old logging canals that had been abandoned for decades. The channels were choked with vegetation, and nobody had seen the bottom in years. When the pumps finally drained the water, the foreman noticed something wrong about the exposed banks. Holes, massive ones, some large enough to fit a basketball, some even larger. He radioed the biology team immediately. Dr. Frank Mazzotti from the University of Florida arrived within hours. Mazzotti has tracked Burmese pythons since the invasion began. He's pulled 100-pound snakes out of suburban backyards. He's seen things that would give most people nightmares for weeks. But when he crouched beside the first burrow and shined his flashlight into the darkness, he went completely silent. The beam hit scales about 3 feet in. Coiled, golden-brown scales attached to a body as thick as a telephone pole, disappearing deeper into the tunnel than his light could reach. The burrow wasn't empty. It was very much occupied. Over the next 48 hours, the team excavated that canal system inch by inch. What they found fundamentally changed their understanding of the python crisis. They pulled 23 Burmese pythons from a single 100-meter stretch of bank. 23 massive constrictors, some coiled together in the same chamber. The largest measured just over 18 feet and weighed an estimated 140 pounds. These weren't random hiding spots. They were dens, elaborate interconnected underground chambers where multiple snakes had been living together for what appeared to be years. Here's what most people don't understand about Florida's python problem. Everyone pictures these snakes slithering through sawgrass, ambushing prey in open marsh. That's part of it. But the drainage revealed something far more disturbing. The pythons aren't visitors to these wetlands. They're permanent residents with established underground infrastructure. The burrows provide everything a giant constrictor needs: stable temperatures year-round, protection from the few predators large enough to threaten an 18-foot snake. And when water levels rise again, the snakes simply retreat into their flooded tunnels, breathing through nostrils positioned at the top of their heads, completely invisible to anyone passing overhead in an airboat. Dr. Mazzotti told his colleagues that researchers had spent years hunting pythons on the surface while entire colonies lived beneath their feet. The traditional capture methods were barely scratching the surface of the problem, literally. So here's the deal. The consequences of this hidden invasion are catastrophic. Since Burmese pythons established breeding populations in the Everglades, mammal populations in the core invasion zone have collapsed. Raccoons down 99%, opossums down 98%. Marsh rabbits have essentially vanished from areas where they were once abundant. These aren't just random animals, they're the foundation of the food web. Every hawk, bobcat, and wading bird depends on that prey base. When it disappears, everything above it starts to starve. The drainage proved that the python problem runs deeper than anyone imagined. Quite literally, the snakes have built cities under the swamp. If this is the first time you're hearing about underground python colonies in Florida, subscribe now, because what crews found in the deeper zones is even worse. The predator pit. When wetlands drain, water doesn't disappear evenly. It flows toward the lowest points, concentrating into whatever depressions exist in the landscape. In the Everglades, these low points are often old alligator holes, ponds the gators themselves have excavated over generations to survive dry seasons. Under normal circumstances, these holes are scattered across the marsh, each supporting its own small ecosystem. But during an artificial drainage event, something unnatural happens. All the water from a massive area funnels into these depressions at once. Suddenly, every surviving creature in hundreds of acres is crammed into the same shrinking space. Biologists call it a predator pit. What it actually looks like is a horror movie playing out in broad daylight. Dr. Adam Rosenblatt, a crocodilian researcher who documented the phenomenon during previous drawdowns, described the scene to colleagues in terms that made several of them reconsider their fieldwork assignments. Imagine a pond the size of a backyard swimming pool. Now, pack 200 alligators into it, bodies pressed against bodies, tails overlapping, jaws inches apart. Add 50,000 panicked fish with nowhere to escape. Then remove any possibility of retreat and let the sun heat that water toward 95 degrees. That's exactly what formed in the deepest channels of the drainage zone. And get this, alligators that normally maintain strict territorial boundaries were crammed scale to scale in the muddy water, snapping at each other over inches of space. The crack of jaws slamming shut carried 50 yards across the exposed lakebed. Researchers watched subordinate gators being physically pinned underwater by dominant males for minutes at a time. Females defended tiny sections of the pit with sustained vicious aggression rather than retreating like they normally would. The feeding was relentless. Fish had nowhere to go, and the alligators ate until their bellies distended visibly, then kept eating. The water churned brown with mud and blood and scales. Within hours of the predator pits forming, birds arrived from miles away, like they'd received some silent signal. Wood storks, great egrets, great blue herons, roseate spoonbills, hundreds of wading birds descended on the pools. The competition became three-dimensional chaos, snapping beaks and thrashing wings fighting for position above the gator-filled water. Dr. Rosenblatt said 12 years studying crocodilians hadn't prepared him for what he witnessed. The drainage had ripped open a window into behaviors and interactions that normally stay completely hidden beneath the murky surface. It was scientifically invaluable. It was also deeply, viscerally unsettling to watch. Here's the catch. While researchers observed these rare interactions, the ecological cost was staggering. Thousands of native fish that would have survived a natural dry season died in those overheated, oxygen-depleted pools. Bodies piled up in the shallows. The smell of death spread for miles. Meanwhile, the armored catfish simply crawled out of the carnage and waited on the mud for better conditions. Every artificial drainage event tips the survival odds further toward the invaders. But the visible chaos of the predator pits wasn't even the most dangerous thing escaping from that drained wetland. Because while everyone watched the alligators tear into trapped fish, something invisible was leaching out of the mud itself. The poison in the mud. Dr. Evelyn Gazer has spent her career studying the chemistry of Everglades sediment, and when she discusses phosphorus contamination, her voice takes an edge that most people reserve for describing active crime scenes. Because in South Florida, that's exactly what it is. A crime scene, a century in the making. For over 100 years, agricultural runoff from sugar farms and cattle ranches has been pouring fertilizer residue into the Everglades watershed. The stormwater treatment areas were built specifically to intercept this contamination. Massive man-made wetlands where plants absorb phosphorus and lock it away in the soil, supposedly permanently. Here's the thing nobody tells you. When you drain one of these treatment areas and expose that phosphorus-rich mud to air, the chemistry changes. Bonds that held the contamination in place start to weaken, and when water returns to the system, some of that stored poison pulses back into the liquid phase and flows downstream toward the park. That released phosphorus fuels explosions of blue-green algae in places like the Caloosahatchee River and St. Lucie Estuary. These aren't just ugly blooms that turn the water green. Blue-green algae, technically cyanobacteria, produces toxins that cause serious illness in humans and can prove fatal to wildlife. The toxins attack the liver and nervous system. They accumulate in fish tissue. They even aerosolize in wave spray, meaning people standing on nearby beaches can inhale them without ever touching the water. It's not that simple though. The algae blooms also consume all the oxygen in the water as they die and decompose, creating dead zones where nothing survives. In severe cases, this triggers massive fish kills, hundreds of thousands of bodies floating belly up, washing onto tourist beaches, creating public health emergencies that make national news. In 2021, a related disaster at Piney Point nearly caused catastrophic dam failure. Authorities had no choice but to release 215 million gallons of contaminated water into Tampa Bay to prevent the reservoir from breaching entirely. That nutrient-loaded discharge fueled a red tide event lasting months, killing an estimated 600 tons of marine life along the Gulf Coast. And get this, the drainage of stormwater treatment area. One West revealed another threat nobody had adequately tracked. Invasive apple snails the size of baseballs were everywhere, with thousands of bright pink egg clusters attached to dead plant stems throughout the area. Each cluster contains hundreds of eggs. The infestation had spread far deeper into protected zones than any previous survey had documented. These snails carry a dangerous passenger, a parasitic worm called rat lungworm that causes severe neurological damage in humans who accidentally ingest contaminated material. The drainage proved this public health threat had been quietly expanding underwater, invisible to everyone, for years. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because despite all the horrors crawling out of that mud, something else was happening in the dried sediment. Something that gave scientists their first real hope in years. The swamp fights back. In 2023, Dr. Gazer's research team published findings that sparked cautious optimism across the restoration community for the first time in a decade. By using carefully controlled drawdowns that mimic the natural dry seasons the Everglades evolved with, not the chaotic artificial drainages, but precisely timed, strategically managed dry periods, researchers managed to reduce invasive plant cover by a remarkable 40% in targeted areas. The suffocating mud dried out under the Florida sun. Invasive fish were physically removed by the thousands. And then something remarkable happened that nobody fully expected. Native plants started coming back completely on their own. Seeds that had been buried in the soil for decades, some possibly lying dormant since before the drainage era began, suddenly germinated when conditions finally matched what the ecosystem had evolved to expect. Sawgrass and native marsh vegetation began reclaiming territory without any replanting efforts whatsoever. The ancient seed bank had been waiting all along. Dr. Geyser told her colleagues the swamp wasn't dying like everyone feared. It had been holding its breath, waiting for conditions to improve, and when they finally let it exhale, it started breathing again on its own. The recovery extended beyond plants. Researchers documented the reappearance of native crayfish and grass shrimp, tiny creatures that form the absolute foundation of the Everglades food web. When these small populations thrive, everything above them has a fighting chance. The birds, the alligators, the fish that haven't been displaced by armored invaders. The entire chain begins to stabilize. Biologists are now using data from these drainage events to build sophisticated maps, showing exactly where invasive species concentrate when water levels drop. They're pinpointing catfish colonies, python den locations, and hidden contamination reservoirs. This isn't just about counting fish anymore. It's tactical warfare against an invasion, using the enemy's own vulnerabilities against them. Here's the catch. This work costs billions of dollars and demands constant political commitment through every budget cycle and election. The swamp doesn't care about funding negotiations, but the restoration projects can't survive without them. Still, the Everglades has survived ice ages, hurricanes, and a century of engineering specifically designed to drain it out of existence. Despite everything humans have thrown at it, the ecosystem keeps fighting to survive. It just needs us to stop making that fight impossible. So here's what keeps me awake at night. Every single time Florida drains a wetland for maintenance, researchers find something they didn't expect hiding in the mud. Underground python cities, invasion infrastructure carved directly into the banks, poison accumulating silently for generations. And we've only examined a tiny fraction of South Florida's wetlands. There are millions of acres nobody has checked. Aquifer systems connecting to underground rivers we can't even map yet. If 23 pythons were hiding in one canal section, how many are living beneath the areas we haven't drained? If authorities keep discovering hidden colonies of invaders every time they pull the plug on a swamp, is it already too late to save the real Florida? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. We're just getting started on what's really hiding beneath Florida's surface. The next video goes even deeper. Trust me, you don't want to miss it.